They laughed when I said I'd start over at 50. The crystal wine glass trembled in my hand, red liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Around our dining table, faces glowed in the candlelight, laughing at something I hadn't caught. I'd spent all afternoon preparing this dinner, Harold's favorite roast, homemade rolls, the good china I only brought out for special occasions. Harold stood, clearing his throat with that self-important sound I'd grown to recognize over 20 years of marriage. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice carrying that artificial warmth he used when he'd already made a decision without me. My stomach tightened. "Mother's moving in with us," he continued, gesturing toward Elaine, who sat at the head of the table like a queen surveying her kingdom. "And Marianne will be moving into the guest cottage out back. We've all agreed it's time she slowed down, gave Mother the proper care she needs in the main house." The room went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then Elaine's thin lips curled into a smile. "A woman your age should be grateful that anyone still needs her for anything." Laughter erupted around the table. Harold's children from his first marriage, Elaine's friends, even the neighbors we'd invited. They were all laughing at me. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments section where you're listening to my revenge story from. I want to know how far it has reached. My name is Marianne Caldwell, though I haven't felt much like myself in years. I'm 67 years old, a retired literature instructor who once believed words could change the world. I was widowed at 45 when my first husband died in a car accident. 2 years later, I met Harold at a community fundraiser. He seemed kind then, a struggling contractor with 2 teenage children, and a business on the verge of collapse. I used my late husband's life insurance money to help save his company. I raised his children when their mother couldn't be bothered. I tended to Elaine's endless demands, driving her to appointments, organizing her medications, listening to her criticisms of everything I cooked, cleaned, or wore. 20 years I gave to this family. That night, after everyone left and the dishes were washed, I sat in our bedroom staring at our joint bank statements. Something felt wrong. I logged into our online banking, my fingers shaking as I typed the password. Half our savings were gone. I found Harold in his study the next morning, reading the newspaper like nothing had happened. "Where's the money?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He didn't even look up. "What money?"
$42,000, Harold.
"Half of our savings account. Where is it?" He folded the newspaper slowly, deliberately. "I moved it to a business account. Some investments came up. Don't worry your head about it. That's my money too. We earned that together." Harold stood, adjusting his reading glasses. "We're married, Marianne. There's no yours or mine. It's ours and I'm managing it." He walked past me, patting my shoulder like I was a confused child. "You should focus on packing up your things for the cottage. Mother moves in next week." I stood there shaking, not with fear, but with a rage I'd suppressed for too many years. The next day, a letter arrived from the bank. My name had been removed from our joint account entirely. I spent the next 3 days searching through old files in the spare bedroom closet, looking for anything that might help me understand what was happening. Dust-covered boxes of old tax returns, insurance papers, and forgotten correspondence. Then I found it. The original property deed to our house, filed away in a manila envelope marked important documents. I pulled it out with trembling hands, scanning the faded text. The house was purchased 12 years ago, shortly after I sold my late husband's home to help Harold expand his business. My name was the only one on the deed. Harold had never updated it. The house was mine. Legally, completely mine. I was still staring at the paper when Elaine appeared in the doorway, leaning on her cane. Her eyes fixed on the document in my hands, and a smile spread across her thin face. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "So you found that?" "Harold knows about the deed," Elaine continued, stepping into the room. "We've been waiting for the right time to have it transferred. You'll sign it over, of course. It's only fair, considering everything we've done for you." I carefully folded the deed and placed it back in the envelope. What exactly have you done for me? Her smile disappeared. Don't be ungrateful, Marianne. Harold married you when no one else would have. At your age, after being widowed, you were lucky to find anyone. After she left, I returned to the boxes. In the very back, under a pile of old student papers I'd saved from my teaching days, I found an unopened letter. The return address made my breath catch. Iris Whitmore, my late aunt. The postmark was from 6 months ago, forwarded from my old address. I tore it open with shaking hands. My dearest Marianne, it began. I'm leaving you the cottage on Silver Lake. It's not much, but it's yours. I always knew you'd need it someday. The letter included a key and another deed. A small lakeside cottage, 2 states away, legally mine. That evening at dinner, I mentioned the cottage. Harold barely looked up from his plate. Your aunt's old shack? That place is probably falling apart by now. I'm thinking of visiting it, I said quietly. He laughed, actually laughed. Visiting? I said nothing more. But that night I began to pack. Not everything, just what mattered. My favorite books, the photographs from my first marriage, my mother's jewelry, my teaching certificates. I worked in silence, moving through rooms I'd cleaned and decorated, past furniture I'd chosen, under lights I'd installed. Before dawn the next morning, while Harold and Elaine still slept, I loaded my car. I left a single note on the kitchen counter, written on the back of an old grocery receipt. You said I had nothing left. Watch me prove you wrong. I drove away as the sun rose, watching our house disappear in my rearview mirror. The cottage was worse than I'd imagined. The roof sagged in the middle, weeds choked the front porch, and one window was completely shattered. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, wondering if I'd made the worst mistake of my life. Then I got out and unlocked the door. Inside, everything was covered in dust and mouse droppings. The furniture was ancient, the wallpaper peeling, the floorboards creaking with every step. But the bones were good, solid wood construction, high ceilings, large windows overlooking the lake. It was mine. Completely, undeniably mine. I spent that first day cleaning, sweeping, scrubbing until my back ached and my hands were raw. As the sun set over Silver Lake, I sat on the porch steps with a bottle of water, watching the light dance on the waves. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. The next morning, I woke to knocking. A woman in her 70s stood on my porch, holding a homemade pie. You're Iris's niece? I'm June. She said you'd come back one day. June became my first friend in that small lakeside town. She introduced me to her book club, the local grocery store owner, the woman who ran the coffee shop on Main Street. Everyone knew everyone here, and slowly, carefully, they began to know me too. The library's looking for volunteers, June mentioned one afternoon over tea. They run adult literacy programs but don't have enough teachers. You taught literature, right? I hadn't stood in front of a classroom in 5 years, hadn't felt the weight of a book I actually wanted to read in even longer. But the next Tuesday, I walked into the small public library and met with the coordinator. 2 weeks later, I was teaching again. My first student was a 40-year-old woman named Patricia, who'd never learned to read properly. We started with children's books, working through sounds and letters, watching her face light up as words began to make sense. One evening, as I was leaving the library, a younger man stopped me in the parking lot. Professor Caldwell? He asked, his face uncertain. I had your American literature class, 15 years ago. You changed my life. Harold called 3 weeks after I left. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Where are you? His voice was sharp, angry. That doesn't matter. You need to come home. Now. We're trying to sell the house, and there's a problem with the deed. Your name is still on it, and you need to sign it over. I felt something cold settle in my chest. No. What do you mean no? Marianne, don't be ridiculous. This is my house. I've lived here for 12 years. And I paid for it, I said quietly. The deed is in my name alone. The house is mine. Silence. Then Elaine's voice screeched in the background. She's useless, Harold. Sue her. Take everything. I hung up. Within a week, I received a letter from Harold's lawyer, demanding I sign over the property. I took it to a local attorney June recommended, a sharp-eyed man named Thomas who reviewed my documents with careful attention. The property is entirely yours, he confirmed. Your husband has no legal claim to it whatsoever. Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying me over his reading glasses. Mrs. Caldwell, may I ask what you want to do with the house? I thought about Harold's face when he'd dismissed me, about Elaine's cruelty, about 20 years of being slowly erased. I want to make sure it stays mine, I said. Then let's talk about trusts and legal protections. I can draft documents that ensure neither your husband nor anyone else can challenge your ownership. We can also explore your options regarding the joint assets that were taken. Over the next month, Thomas helped me secure both properties in an irrevocable trust. I also discovered that Harold had forged my signature on several financial documents, which gave me legal grounds to recover some of what he'd stolen. But more importantly, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: control over my own life. I began writing in the evenings, essays about aging, about betrayal, about the strange freedom that comes from losing everything you thought defined you. One essay, titled The Art of Beginning Again, I submitted to the local newspaper on a whim. The editor called me 3 days later. Mrs. Caldwell, we'd like to run your piece on the front page of our Sunday lifestyle section. Would that be acceptable? I almost laughed. Acceptable? I hadn't published anything since my teaching days, and hadn't thought anyone would care what a 67-year-old woman had to say about starting over. The article ran that Sunday. By Monday morning, the newspaper office was flooded with responses. Letters poured in from women who'd felt the same dismissal, the same erasure, the same desperate need to prove they still mattered. The editor asked for another essay, then another. Within 2 months, I had a regular column called Second Acts. One letter stood out among the dozens I received. It was from a man named Vincent, who identified himself as Harold's former business partner. I thought you should know, he wrote, that Harold's company is collapsing. He's been mismanaging funds for years. You might want to watch the local news. I didn't have to wait long. Harold's construction company declared bankruptcy the following week, making headlines in his hometown newspaper. Creditors were circling, employees were suing for unpaid wages, and investigators were looking into financial misconduct. Elaine went on social media, posting long rants about how I'd abandoned her son in his time of need, how I was a heartless woman who'd destroyed a good man. Her friends shared her posts, adding their own vicious comments. I didn't respond. I'd learned that dignity was its own form of power. Instead, I kept teaching, kept writing, and kept rebuilding the cottage. June's son helped me repair the roof. A local handyman fixed the plumbing. I painted the walls myself, choosing colors I actually liked, soft blues and warm creams that reminded me of the lake. One Saturday, June brought her book club to my house for our meeting. 8 women crowded into my small living room, drinking tea and discussing the novel we'd chosen. After we finished, June pulled out a newspaper clipping, my latest essay. She read it aloud while the others listened. When she finished, they applauded. Harold showed up on a cold November afternoon, for months after I'd left. I heard his car before I saw it, the engine he'd always refused to fix finally giving out completely as he pulled into my driveway. He looked terrible. Thinner, grayer, his expensive clothes replaced with worn jeans and a faded jacket. He climbed my porch steps slowly, like each one cost him something. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Marianne," he said, and his voice cracked. "Please. I need to come home." "This is my home now," I replied. "I mean our house. Your house. Whatever. I've lost everything. The business is gone. The bankruptcy took most of what we had left. Elaine had to move into assisted living. I'm living in a motel." He reached for my hand. I stepped back. "Please. I'm begging you. Let me come back. We can start over." I looked at this man I'd once loved, or thought I loved, or convinced myself I loved because I was afraid of being alone. "Would you like some tea?" I asked. Hope flashed across Harold's face. He followed me inside, looking around at the cottage I'd transformed. Fresh paint, clean windows, my books lining shelves I'd installed myself. I made tea in silence, set a cup in front of him at my small kitchen table. He wrapped his hands around it like he was freezing. Marianne, I made mistakes. I see that now. I should have valued you more, treated you better. But we're still married. We can fix this. No, I said gently. We can't. He started to argue, but something in my face stopped him. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, sliding it across the table. This came yesterday. Foreclosure notice on the house. Your house. They're taking it next month. I picked up the envelope, studying the official stamps and legal language. Then I set it down. That's unfortunate. Unfortunate? Marianne, that's our home. It was never our home, Harold. It was my house that you lived in. There's a difference. He left 20 minutes later, his tea untouched, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Thomas called me a week later. Mrs. Caldwell, the property you own with your husband's address, it's going to auction next month. Have you considered what you want to do about it? I'd thought about little else. That house held 20 years of my life, both the good memories from early in our marriage and the painful ones that followed. Letting it go to strangers felt wrong, like erasing my own history. Can I buy it? I asked. At auction? Certainly. We can set up a trust or limited liability company to make the purchase if you'd like to keep your involvement private. 3 weeks later, through a legal entity Thomas created, I bought Harold's foreclosed house for 30 cents on the dollar. Harold never knew it was me. I had no intention of living there again. But I rented it to a young family with 3 children, the kind of family that would fill those rooms with the life and love they'd been missing. As for Elaine, she'd suffered a stroke and moved to a nursing facility. Harold visited her daily, I heard, a broken man caring for his broken mother. My essays caught the attention of a publisher in the spring. She called me on a Tuesday morning while I was preparing for my literacy class. Mrs. Caldwell, I've been reading your second acts column. Have you considered expanding these into a book? I hadn't. But once the idea was planted, it grew quickly. Over the next 6 months, I wrote early in the mornings before teaching, late at night when the lake was silent. I poured every painful lesson I'd learned into those pages, every moment of doubt and fear and eventual triumph. The Age of Starting Over was published 10 months later. The launch was small, at the local bookstore in town. I expected maybe 20 people, my students in June's book club. Instead, over 100 women showed up, many of them readers who'd followed my newspaper column. A woman in her 50s approached me after the reading, tears streaming down her face. You gave me permission to leave, she whispered. I thought I was too old to start over. But you did it. So can I. That's when I understood what I'd really written. Not just my story, but a map for anyone who'd ever felt invisible. The book sold well, far better than anyone expected. Within 3 months, I was invited to speak at a women's conference in Chicago, then another in Denver, then a book club event in Atlanta. I stood on stages I never imagined standing on, telling my story to rooms full of strangers who somehow understood exactly what I'd survived. The message was always the same. It's never too late. You're never too old. You're never too far gone to begin again. One evening, after a particularly large event, my phone rang. It was Harold's daughter from his first marriage, now in her 40s. Marianne? It's Stephanie. I read your book. I wanted to apologize for how we treated you. We were awful, and you didn't deserve it. Dad's been telling everyone you abandoned us, but reading your book, I see now what really happened. I listened as she cried, as she explained that Harold had fed them lies for years, that they'd believed him because it was easier than confronting the truth. I forgive you, I said, and I meant it. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or allowing them back into my life. It meant releasing the weight I'd been carrying. Harold's children weren't the only ones who reached out. Elaine's nurse called on a Saturday morning in July. Mrs. Caldwell? This is Marie from Riverside Care Facility. Mrs. Whitmore has been asking for you. She's not doing well. The doctors say it's a matter of days now, maybe hours. I hadn't seen Elaine since the night of that terrible dinner. Part of me wanted to refuse, to let her face death without the comfort she'd denied me in life. But another part, the part that had grown stronger in my time away, understood that this wasn't about her. It was about who I wanted to be. I drove 3 hours to the facility. Elaine was barely conscious, her once sharp eyes clouded and distant. I sat beside her bed, holding her papery hand. Her eyes focused on me slowly. "Marianne," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You were the strong one. I see that now." She died that night, quietly, with me sitting beside her. The funeral was small. Harold had no money for anything elaborate, so I paid for it, a simple service with a handful of mourners. Harold looked at me across Elaine's casket with an expression I couldn't quite read. Confusion maybe, or gratitude, or shame. After the service, I placed a single white lily on her grave and whispered, "We're even now." I didn't stay for the reception. I drove back to Silver Lake, back to my cottage, back to my new life. That evening, an email arrived from my publisher. "The Age of Starting Over" has hit the bestseller list. A major morning show wanted me for an interview. A magazine was requesting a feature article. I sat on my porch watching the sunset, my laptop open on my knees, reading message after message from women thanking me for showing them it was possible. This was success, but not the kind I'd imagined in my younger years. It wasn't fame or money or validation from the people who'd hurt me. It was knowing I'd helped someone else find their way out of the dark. The morning show interview aired on a Tuesday. I sat in a professional studio in New York, wearing a dress June had helped me choose, answering questions about my journey with an honesty that still surprised me. "Your husband must be proud of your success," the host said, smiling warmly. I smiled back, a small, knowing smile. "My former husband and I are separated. This journey has been mine alone." The clip went viral. Within days, my book sales tripled. Speaking requests flooded in. A major women's magazine asked to feature me on their cover. When I returned to Silver Lake, June was waiting on my porch with champagne and homemade cookies. "You're famous," she laughed, hugging me tightly. "I'm just me," I said. But I knew something had shifted, not in who I was, but in how the world saw me. A week later, I received the magazine in the mail. My face on the cover, gray hair and all, with the headline, "The Woman Who Started Over at 67. Harold saw it at the unemployment office, according to Stephanie, who called to tell me he'd stared at it for 10 minutes before walking out. The university invitation arrived in August, a formal letter requesting that I deliver the commencement speech at my alma mater, the same institution where I'd taught for 15 years before retiring. I accepted immediately. The day of the speech, I stood backstage in my academic robes, my hands shaking slightly as I reviewed my notes. This was the university that had quietly pushed me into early retirement, suggesting younger professors were better suited to connect with students. Now they were honoring me. I walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. Thousands of graduates and their families filled the stadium. And there, in the back row of the faculty section, I saw him. Harold. He looked older, more fragile, out of place in his borrowed suit. Our eyes met for a moment, and he quickly looked away. I began my speech. "Members of the graduating class," I started, my voice steady despite the microphone and the crowd. "You stand here today at the beginning of your lives, full of promise and potential. I'm here to tell you that beginnings happen more than once." I spoke about my career, my first marriage, my years of teaching. I spoke about Harold without naming him, about the loss of identity that happens slowly, invisibly, until you wake up one day and don't recognize yourself. "You can lose everything," I said, looking out over the sea of young faces, "and still keep your self-respect if you refuse to let cruelty define you." My eyes found Harold again. He was crying, his head bowed. "Some of you will face betrayal. Some will face failure. Some will be told you're too old, too late, too much or not enough. But here's what I learned at 67 years old. The only person who can make you small is yourself. Everyone else is just practicing. The stadium erupted in applause. A standing ovation that went on and on, waves of sound washing over me. After the ceremony, I stood near the campus garden, accepting congratulations from former colleagues who'd once pushed me aside. They were effusive now, full of praise, conveniently forgetting how easily they'd dismissed me. Harold approached slowly, like a man walking to his execution. "Marianne," he said, his voice hoarse. "That speech, it was, I'm sorry. For everything. I was wrong about you. About everything." I studied the man I'd spent 20 years with, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. He wasn't a villain, just a weak man who'd needed someone to be smaller than him to feel big. "Thank you for the lesson, Harold," I said gently. "Losing you gave me back myself. I'm grateful for that." His face crumpled. He tried to speak, but no words came. I touched his arm briefly, not with affection, but with closure. "Take care of yourself." Then I walked away, toward the parking lot where June was waiting, toward my car, toward my life. A woman in a professional suit approached me, before I could leave. "Mrs. Caldwell? I'm from Cascade Films. We'd love to discuss adapting your book." The film deal moved slowly, as these things do, but the contract I signed was generous. More than generous. Enough that I could finally stop worrying about money altogether. I used some of it to renovate the cottage properly, adding a sunroom where I could write overlooking the lake. I donated a substantial amount to the library's literacy program, enough to hire 2 full-time instructors and expand classes to neighboring towns. The rest I put into a trust for Harold's children, not because they deserved it, but because I could afford to be generous now. My second book, a memoir titled Becoming Whole, was published the following spring. It sold even better than the first, climbing bestseller lists and winning awards I'd never imagined receiving. But the real victory wasn't the success or the money or the recognition. It was the morning I woke up at 70 years old, in my cottage by the lake, and realized I was completely, genuinely happy. June and I had coffee on my porch, watching the sun rise over Silver Lake. My students were progressing, reading books they'd never thought they'd understand. My writing reaches people every day. That evening, I sat in my sunroom with my laptop, working on the opening chapters of my third book. The magazine cover June had framed hung on the wall beside a photograph of my younger self. The woman who'd once believed her value came from being needed by others. She looked like a stranger to me now. My phone buzzed with a text from Stephanie. "Dad's doing better. He got a job at a hardware store. He talks about you sometimes, with respect now. Says you were the strongest person he ever knew." I smiled and set the phone aside. Outside, the lake reflected the sunset, gold and pink and orange bleeding across the water. A loon called in the distance, its cry lonely and beautiful. I saved my document and closed my laptop. Tomorrow I'll write more. Tomorrow I'll teach another class. Tomorrow I'd continue building this second life I'd carved from the ruins of the first. But tonight, I simply sat in the home I'd made, in the life I'd created, in the peace I'd earned. Starting over isn't for the young, I thought, watching the stars emerge one by one. It's for the brave. And somewhere out there, in the world beyond my lake, in living rooms and coffee shops and quiet moments before dawn, women were reading my words and finding their own courage to begin again. They weren't laughing anymore. They were cheering. And I was finally completely free.